You know, Warner, they're talking about getting rid of the lottery over in the North Village.
Used to be a saying, lottery in June, corn be heavy soon.
Lottery in June. Corn be heavy soon.
Welcome to Vassals of Kingsgrave. My name is Glenn. I am Douglas Rivers from the forum. Joining me today is Bina 007
Hi, everyone.
and Zach K.
Hey, this is Zach, also known as Alias in the forums.
What we're discussing today is The Lottery, written by Shirley Jackson. It was published in the New Yorker in 1948 and gained tremendous feedback from the readers of that magazine. Not particularly good feedback, because there were a lot of complaints, there were a lot of demands for their subscription to be dropped because of the story, but because of that it's helped it gain a following, and I believe that from what I have read online, it tends to be it's a standard story which American high schools are taught. What I'm interested in is how you got introduced to the story. In my case, let's see, I found out about the story. It was after reading The Hunger Games, and I was looking around reviews of the Hunger Games book, and I seen an Amazon review, and they compared the reaping scene to the lottery. So that's how I found out about it, and then I found it online, and it was a great story, and I've been interested in it ever since, and that's why I'm interested in doing this podcast today. But I'm interested how you got introduced to the story.
Well, for me, it first came up, like you said, it is a thing that we do talk about a lot in American high schools. It came up for me in my 6th grade English class, I think. I don't think we actually read it, but we were talking about The Giver by Lois Lowry, and this story also came up in that discussion. Then I didn't really read into it too much until I also was reading The Hunger Games and was looking at background on that kind of stuff, and the lottery came up, and I thought it was a really interesting read when I actually did pick it up, and I thought that it was interesting how much that same type of story has come up in recent times.
And Bina, how did you get introduced to the story?
I read it in school. I guess we were all about 12, and we were doing a lot of dystopian fiction. So stuff like Lord of the Flies and, things like that. So this came up as a short story to read, and I was intrigued by it and quite shocked by it, which I guess is the reaction of most people. And I really didn't look at it since then. And it's kind of weird because I've since read The Hunger Games and I've watched the Hunger Games movie. And I completely forgot that the reaping is basically lifted directly from this. But I went back and read it in advance of this podcast. And I was surprised actually at how short it was and, in a sense, how measured. I mean, I think my memory of it was much more shocking than the reality of reading it again. But maybe that's just because I'm older and wiser.
It does sound like a great thing. I wish I had read it in high school, but it wasn't one of the ones selected in any of the English classes that I studied. Just a warning to everyone that this will be a spoiler-filled on the story, so the ending will be given away. Who won the lottery will be given away. So a summary of the
It's
story.
a very well-read story, so you have to be careful about the spoilers, of course.
Absolutely. So a summary of the story would be that it's June 27th, and the entire town gathers in the town square for the lottery. So the rules of the lottery are each head of house within the town selects one slip of paper from a black box. Once everyone has selected a slip of paper, the one that selected the black mark on the slip of paper, that's the family that won the lottery. And there is a second drawing for the family members. They would select another slip of paper, and the one that selects the black mark in this drawing would win the lottery, and the punishment of winning the lottery is they are stoned to death. And that is the story of the lottery. We can go into detail on the characters in the character discussion, but that's the main story of the lottery.
Yeah, and the thing that always struck me the first time I read this and on subsequent rereads was how normal everything seemed at first, how it just seemed like a normal day for these people. And after recently watching that little short film that I saw, the 2009 version, I thought, wow, this just seems like a normal day for these people. And the shocking reveal that we get in the end really is a nice juxtapose to that.
It seems like there's a somber mood going on within the town, like no one wants to be there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And no one, you can tell that it's not a good thing to win the lottery.
Oh yeah, definitely. You can definitely get that pervasive sense of dread that a lot of these people are feeling. But I think that actually one of the really disturbing things for me is how lightly the kids seem to be taking it. They're at the beginning they're piling up the stones, and at the end they very easily seem to react to what they have to do. They don't seem to feel too much concern about it, and I think that's the really disturbing element of the story that you get the feeling of very early on.
And it's also disturbing that the kids select the smallest stones, so they want to draw out the death.
Right.
Or do you think it's just that the kids, little hands pick little stones? I mean, I thought what was disturbing to me was that the kids, because that's what they've grown up with and they don't question it. So yeah, it is very casual for them because this is just what happens every year and it's a lark. And that's what saddened me. But with the adults, I mean, we can get into it later, but the idea of Mrs. Delacroix, who is good friends with the woman who eventually gets chosen, as adults, just pitches in very happily. But, when I first started reading the opening parts of this story, it did seem kind of weird. Something was just off. So maybe the fact that it's a rural setting, maybe the fact that it seems a little bit anachronistic. And then you just get little hints that something's a bit weird, like when one of the women comes up and says, well, you know what, I'm going to have to be the person who pulls the lot. And everyone's saying, but don't you have a son? Like, so little things about the way in which men and women are treated differently. So there are little hints all the way through. Of course, you don't understand just how bent out of shape this society is until you get to the end.
And it's clear that it's not just this town where the lottery takes place, because they mention other towns where it's taking place, and it seems like a thing which is throughout the country. That was always my impression, that it's a normal thing within America.
Although
the lottery is taking place.
Yeah, although some towns have apparently decided or are discussing not having the lottery, which always made me wonder how much of a compulsion there was towards doing it. So is it the case that there's a federal law that you have to have the lottery? Or is it just that, there's a lot made of the ritual about how, the black box and the tradition and all that kind of stuff? Or is it just something that people cling to because they're very comfortable with it?
To me, that's one of the most interesting things about the story is the fact that they're self-guiding and that there is this sense that if they wanted to, they could stop whenever they wanted. It's not like the Hunger Games where you have the peacekeepers keeping the order and you don't have that thing to worry about. I mean, you get the sense that Mr. Summers is like a guy who's controlling things, and there might be a slight repercussion if you didn't show up to the lottery in the town square. But if these other towns are just stopping on a whim and there doesn't seem to be any active response, then why are they still doing it? And I think that's one of the big things is how they're just accepting this. They're just letting it happen.
Yeah, and that's the amazing thing about having such a slim, short story, that there's so much ambiguity around the edges of it. It's very straightforwardly written and it's very matter of fact, but there's so many things to discuss around the edges of it. And, who appointed Mr. Summers boss?
It seems just he was appointed because he didn't have any children. That's all that we know from the story. Mr. Summers, he organises a lot of social committee events within the town.
Right, so yeah, he's just kind of like a town leader in general. It's not just the lottery, so... I think that's interesting.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I love the irony of his name, Mr. Summers, who's basically arranging the stoning to death. Whereas a lot of the other names are quite heavy-handed, aren't they? Like Mr. Graves.
Right.
But yeah, I did find that quite funny. This very jovial guy who's, basically the instrument of death.
There's a lot of that opposing imagery that shows up in this besides his name. There's it opens with this description of a clear and sunny day full of warmth and all this happiness and all this good stuff, and then it's very much juxtaposed against this very dour and this very grim situation they're dealing with.
And it's the last day of school for all the kids.
Right. It's supposed to be a
Start
happy
of
day.
summer.
Yeah.
School's out for summer. Let's have a stoning. It just, the thing is, like, when I read it when I was a kid, I guess I was the same age as some of the kids who are gathering up stones, and it was obviously quite shocking. Whereas now it has a bit of when I read it recently, I just kept on thinking of that scene in Monty Python's The Life of Brian where they start having a stoning.
I mean, you do get that sort of that grossly humoristic feeling to how things are playing out. Like, it seems like it's almost a madness of the situation that they're just doing these things on a whim. It seems like it's just a normal part of their routine. It's kind of weird.
And it's tradition. But it also mentions parts of the tradition which have been lost along the way. So there, it does mention a recital which used to take place. But over the years, people have just decided not to do that, not to bother with that anymore. So parts of the tradition remain, but it's skewed. So parts of it remain, but parts of it have been lost along the generations.
I love that, and I think it's a really it's a clever indictment of any modern kind of rituals and rites. The idea that Christmas has all these kind of sort of echoes of paganism, so things like having the Christmas tree and whatnot from ancient festivals that sort of linger on in a mutated, bastardized form. And all sorts of these sort of modern religious festivals have these sort of echoes of ancient past, or even political stuff, with all the sort of echoes to ancient Greece. So I think that's really clever and very savage. It's just when you really start to think about it and all the sort of ritualized holiday-related stuff that we do and how much really kind of has a basis in some kind of rationalism or actual text versus just, well, that's how we always did it. Seems very realistic to me.
Yeah, and I think that's a key theme of the story, this whole idea that they're just kind of accepting what was done before. And I think that shows up a lot in Old Man Warner, who very much takes pride in the fact that he's been a part of, I think, 77 of these. And that's a point of pride for him, and that's a point of tradition. He's very ardently defending of that, whereas some of the younger characters are more, I feel like, willing to step outside that boundary.
Okay, so who do you think are the biggest proto-revolutionaries here, the biggest doubters? Which characters are stepping out?
I'm trying to look and see who was the one who actually brings up the fact that they're not using the lottery anymore in.
That was Mrs. Delacroix.
Right.
And I think it was Mr. Adams.
Which
they
is
have
curious.
That discussion with Old Man Warner.
It's curious that they're so willing to bring these things up, and yet when the lottery actually comes about, they're first ones to step up to take part.
Yeah, it's like there's a disconnect, right? So you can, on one hand, be quite rational and discuss, well, that village over, they're not doing it anymore. But when the bell rings, it's time to go, and everyone kind of clicks back into their sort of their other reality where you could just get on with the stoning. It's really frightening, and I wonder how much of I don't know much about the author actually, but I wonder when she wrote it, because it's quite soon after the end of World War II, isn't it, that she published this story?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how much she had the just following orders kind of Nazi mentality in mind.
Well, it was published in 1948, post World War II.
So I do wonder whether that was an influence on it.
And I think that one of the profoundly disturbing things about that sort of dichotomy where they're perfectly willing to be rational, I think that's a lot more disturbing than the fact that they're rational and then not when the time comes, as opposed to stories like The Giver where they're fully indoctrinated and they're fully drones to this sort of mentality. It seems like they're not here, but they're still willing to do it. I think that's more disturbing because it's more realistic.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's exactly that reason, which is why she probably got all the hate mail and why, the New Yorker got all the abuse for publishing the story, because she's not demonizing the people who do it. They're not distant from us. Certainly to an American reader at the time, it's something rather close. And so there is a sort of unspoken indictment of the reader. Like, how different are you really from these folks? And would you just do the same? So yeah, the savage reaction is very understandable.
In terms of the dissent from the town, who else would be? I get the impression that Mrs. Dunbar has lost favour with the lottery because first I suspect that her son won the lottery the previous year. Just at the end, when Mrs. Delacroix say hurry up, and she just hangs back. So I guess she doesn't want to take part in the lottery anymore. She's maybe just trying to avoid stoning Tessie.
That's a good point. Also, I feel like when she's first talking about her husband who broke his leg, it seems like when she's saying that she'll step up to draw for him, there's a sort of insolent quality to what she's saying, or just a less respect where she's like, me, I guess. I could be reading that wrong, but that's sort of the impression I got.
Yeah, because I guess as little as we know about the society, a woman saying she's going to do a man's role is quite subversive. So I would agree with that. And it did make me think a little bit, like, how would you be a parent in such a society? I mean, is there an element of you that holds back fully from, or tries to hold back from loving your children just in case you're going to lose in the next year? I mean, it must really infect the way in which you have relationships with your family, because, you know, your kid could be stoning you next year and vice versa. I mean, it's
yeah, it's a really hard thing to fathom. Just this whole notion that this thing is looming over them for their whole lives.
Yeah, and what purpose does it serve? I mean, you read some of these dystopian novels in which, in fact, there's a Hollywood movie coming out later this summer, where the premise of the movie is that on one particular day of the year, everyone gets to go out and the laws don't hold. So if you want to loot, rob, murder, go for it. You know, and there'll be no repercussions the next day. And there it's seen as a kind of a necessary psychological release that for the other 364 days, it keeps everyone on a much more even keel because they can just let everything out that one night in this act of catharsis. And I'm just wondering, you know, for the villagers that choose to keep up with the lottery, we don't really get much of the rationale. So is it just blind tradition? So we've always done it. Or do they see some kind of social value? I
think they see it as, I get the impression it's a farming type village. So they believe that by doing the lottery every year, then they'll get the right weather to grow their crops, and they'll their economy will prosper because of that.
Okay, so it's like a sacrificial offering to the gods.
To the gods,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that shows up a bit in what Old Man Warner says, where he gives this little phrase. Where is it? Lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. And I think that's where that really shows up. I don't know if it's just part of the tradition and if it's totally meaningless, but I get the sense from that they do derive some sort of import to it, whether or not that's meaningful. Yeah, this sort of superstition related to it, at least for him.
Yeah. So I wonder how much it's that. I wonder how much it's also you're complicit in a group act, right?
Right.
So it binds you together as a community. And actually, there's a parallel there to World War Z. We just did a Vassals of Kingsgrave on the World War Z books, and there's a point where the Russian army, which is struggling to keep people in check, and in the army, in the face of the zombie attacks, everyone wants to just go home and defend their family, and they enforce a decimation. So one person from each battalion, from each group, is just going to get basically effectively stoned but shot to death. And it brings a certain sense of cohesion, and because everybody's complicit, so then it's us against the world. So I thought, sacrificial lamb. Secondly, act of cohesion, complicity, and thirdly, maybe it's just something that gets out vents all the frustration. Although you don't really see that in the short story, so I'm probably reading that onto it.
So the first family would be the Hutchison family. So within the story, it is. The Hutchison family win the first drawing. Bill Hutchison draws the black mark. Then in the second drawing, Bill, his wife Tessie, their three kids, Dave, Bill and Nancy, do the second drawing. And it is Tessie that wins the lottery and is ultimately stoned to death. So we are introduced to Tessie in the first few lines of the story because she is the one that arrives late to the lottery, to the town centre, because she had forgotten which day it was today.
Do you find that plausible that she would forget? I mean, such a momentous day. Do you find that realistic?
I
Or
don't.
do you...
I always wonder about the motivations of the character, because it seems implausible, because she has, as far as we know, she has lived in this town her entire life and has gone through 40 or so lotteries, and you would just know that is a day, June 27th, you wouldn't forget that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got the sense she was definitely shirking there. Why? I'm not sure. It definitely seemed like she was a little bit more nervous than everyone else, but I'm not sure why that could be. I don't know if there's something that affected her or something like that. But yeah, I definitely did get that sense.
I do get the impression that she enjoys the lottery. Before she
Really?
is selected, she actually really enjoys going to the lottery. But maybe it's the 1969 short movie. She just seems to really relish in the lottery.
I haven't seen
which
that one.
Yeah, I don't think that I have seen it. I don't think that's really. I don't think that's really in the text. I think the first time you read it, it's just like, oh, she's late, she's a bit scatty. But the second time, you think, well, how plausible is that in this village? And is there something subconscious about hanging back? But they haven't lost anyone, have they, yet, to the lottery, this family?
No, I don't believe so.
No.
So as a mother, it's not like she'd be thinking, oh, God, I lost my son last year, so I want to hold back. But yeah, interesting. The problem is there's so little in the story. It's so bare that you find yourself just reading into every single occurrence and line.
But I imagine if the tradition has gone on for so long, every family within the town would have been affected and lost someone.
Absolutely. Because it's not a big town, right? So.
It's definitely true. I think that there's a definite distinction, though, between the people who live alone, the Mr. Summers and the Old Man Warners, and the families. I think that there's definitely a different sense about them. It seems like the people who live alone are more willing to accept this sort of thing because they have no one to care about. And I think that is definitely a thing to think about. Do you think they've lost people?
Oh, the Hutchison family. I think so. I guess maybe not this family where Bill is the man of the house, but maybe one of Bill's brothers or something like that.
Yeah, and in this town where you have the lottery, I find any person who's basically on their own, like a Mr. Summers type character, a bit suspicious insofar as I do feel that maybe they've lost everyone else. Maybe they're battle hardened. Maybe subconsciously they're thinking, well, I've lost everyone, so right, let's go for equality now. It's Yul's turn.
Once Tessie is selected, so there is a point where they ask about households, other households. So Bill has drawn for the Hutchison household, and if there are other households that can take part in the lottery, and Tessie just immediately suggests Dawn and Eva. So Eva would be her daughter, but she no longer draws with the Hutchison family because she is now married into another family. So what do you think about that? It just struck me as an awful thing, but I guess in the heat of the moment, it's possible for anyone.
I thought that was one of the more disturbing things about Tessie, was that she seems very vindictive for whatever reason, and she doesn't seem to have a reason to be. I don't know. It's kind of a curious trait of her character.
Yeah, why would you throw your daughter under a bus? I mean, it's bad enough that your immediate family is in this predicament. Now you want to drag in your now married daughter. But then I wondered if maybe the author was just making Tessie do that to point out another example of how that society was quite misogynistic, right, so that the daughter now draws with the husband's family. So I'm not sure whether it's there for another reason, but it does make Tessie look really kind of sketchy.
I also do think it was since Tessie is one of the primary characters, to show that the people are in some sense willing to throw each other under the bus. That's just something ingrained in their DNA when it comes to the lottery. They will make sure that everyone takes their turn.
Yeah, and absolutely, because with odds that low, when it's 4-1 or whatever, adding another two people into the mix does make a difference. And yeah, that kind of raw, savage will to survive, I guess, even if it is your kids, because at the end of the day, it's everyone for themselves in this case. But that's even more disturbing because, it subconsciously, whenever we read something, we're reading our own ideas of how society functions in it. And this concept that you would protect your children at all costs is a very deep grained one. So it's really shocking when you see it violated so immediately and so casually.
How do you think that comes about, though, where that switch happens, where it's like that?
Yeah, because there's a sort of, I don't know, I always come at things from my movie perspective, but, the classic movie response is parents doing anything to save their children and not throw the children under the bus, right? That's the classic sort of heroic, noble kind of image of the parent. But I think this is almost, sad to say, more realistic. But, that could just be my nihilism coming through.
I think you have a point. The thing for me, though, is that the dominating factor? Is it that they are actually very much against each other, or is there a cohesion being formed? It seems like it's hard to lean either way on that.
Yeah, it's a bizarre kind of combination, isn't it?
Right.
In one sense, they're all complicit. There is this sort of the mob mentality is there.
Yeah.
But in the midst of the mob, you're never more alone than in the midst of a mob, because it's savage, uncaring. If you're breaking down every single kind of one of the normal bonds that ties us together, like family, parent, child, whatever, just to be in this amorphous mob, that is a big contradiction, internal contradiction. And I think that's why the story is so powerful.
Yeah, I think the story is actually full of a lot of contradictions, which is one of the big parts to it for me.
And I guess one last point would be, I think it's Mrs. Delacroix that walks past Dave and gives him a few pebbles, so he must participate in the lottery.
See, so that's the point at which I thought that there's, beyond a sacrifice to the gods of the harvest, that there's a point in getting cohesion through complicity, because otherwise, why would she be at pains to make sure he was participating? I mean, maybe if you saw someone not participating, you'd think, you know what, just let him be. But I think the author's trying to do something very specific there and show us that when you yourself are having to take part in something quite ruthless, you want everybody else to be in it with you, because otherwise, if they get an opt-out, why can't you? Especially when she's doing it to her best friend.
Yeah, that is probably motivated by selfish reasons, though, as opposed to wanting the community to have that sense of cohesion.
Yeah, shared complicity. So it's about sharing out guilt, I guess. Well, none of them ever really seem that guilty, or appear to be that guilty.
So with the Dunbar family, this is so I've got my thoughts are on the previous year of the lottery. It seems to me that it would be either the Dunbar family or the Watson family that won. So I sometimes go between one and the other. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it, but I always think that. So the Dunbar family won the previous year, and their oldest son was selected to win the lottery, and that's why Mr. Dunbar wants to stay at home with his broken leg or whatever. And Jack Watson draws for his family this year, but his father was selected 2 years ago. So the previous year he was not old enough to draw for his mother, but this year he can.
I definitely agree with you. I think that there's definitely a case to be made for that. For the Dunbars, they very much seem alienated by something, and that would be the most obvious example of what could be happening to them. And also, I got the sense that as they were drawing, that they just didn't really care about this anymore. That they just were not complicit to the situation as much as everyone else.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's a good reading of it. And I also got that the Dunbars are somehow, they're participating, but they're somehow outside of it in a way. It's very clear, I think, from the text.
Mrs. Dunbar does seem very withdrawn during the selection process. She talks about Horace is not but 16 yet, she said regretfully. That seems to show her attitude to the lottery now.
She comes across as depressed, actually. Just very, very outside of herself and withdrawn, and yeah.
There is a line by Mrs. Dunbar. So after Tessie is selected, and even before this happens, she tells her son Horace to run tell her father when it's time. And then once Tessie is selected, she says, "Run and tell your father." I was always confused by this line, because is she telling her son to go get to tell his father, so that the father can come back to the town square and take part in the lottery, in the stoning?
I don't know. I guess the sense I got was just that she was telling him to go inform the father that they were safe another year, that they had passed. So he wouldn't have anything to worry about, but that's possible too. I don't know.
But then, I mean, he's got a broken leg. How is he going to get there in time?
Exactly. That's true. Yeah. That's why I did get the sense that he wasn't actually coming back, that he was just getting there so that they could relieve him of the worry that someone else in the Dunbar family might have been picked.
So the next one up is the Walter Frey of this story, Old Man Warner. So he has taken part in 77 lotteries, so I guess he would be around 80 years old or so.
Do they start when they're 3, or did
I always get that impression. Like they might start when they're old enough to walk, maybe.
Yeah, God, what a sketchy character, much like Walter Frey. And I just think anyone who's survived 77 of these, I mean, it must make you quite hard and quite cynical. You must really believe that you're, I don't know, lucky. I find all the characters in this who are old and who maybe don't have kids very suspicious indeed. And also as the guys who are protecting tradition, as the guys who think back to the days when the black box was, the original one, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I mean, these are the guys preserving that tradition, aren't they? Through which the oral tradition continues. So I find them very sketchy indeed.
And that brings me to what we were mentioning earlier, is do you think that they are totally jaded by the fact that they've been through this so many times, or by the fact that they've lost people as a result of the lottery, and that's hardened them to the reality of it, and to actually almost give it this sort of reverence because they've felt the effects and they feel that others should too?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in that Walter Frey kind of manner, so what, kill my wife, I'll get another one.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, how would you emotionally survive to go through 77 of these?
That's a good point.
You've got to harden yourself a little bit just to get through it, surely.
He does seem like the most brainwashed of everyone. So he has lived through this for such a long time that's, it would be second nature to him.
Well, brainwashed or brainwashing, or both. So brainwashed because if you've been complicit in the death of 77 people, you have to make yourself believe it's for a reason. But also an agent of brainwashing as one of the elder people who transmits these rituals down. So I think on both counts.
Both are valid, yes.
If you draw on the first round, but all your surrounding family is dead already, is there a second round? I mean, that's just doubt it. Game over, basically,
that's
right?
That's probably it.
Yeah. He's one lucky son of a bitch.
To me, he's one of the more nuanced characters in the story. Not nuanced as in he has many facets, but the fact that you see a lot about him. I think that he's one of the more characters that you get the sense that he's been the most affected by this experience, and you really get an insight into that from the discussions he has, and that's why I think it's fascinating to oppose him against the many other characters in the story that have a different perspective.
We can move on to the Summers family. So let's see, the first point would be, so he doesn't have children. So does anyone think that his kids were selected at one point, or he just never had children?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't think I have any evidence for this whatsoever, but I somehow think Old Man Warner has had family, but Mr. Summers didn't. But I don't know why. Maybe it's just the name. Maybe it's just the Mr. Summers name just indicates to me someone who's been untouched personally by it.
Yeah, you almost get this feeling he's like the smiling guy who will do whatever it takes, like a sort of accepting person who just is into it almost, who almost gets very into this duty he has, which is very much in contrast to the other characters.
Yeah, it's kind of weird when I think about this this book to myself. I always imagine a kind of Bill Clinton smiling, jovial figure. in my in my sort of weird, surreal Beano world casting of this short story. Yeah, he just strikes me as untouched by anything nasty and battle hardened and depressed like some of the other characters are.
I always get the sense, well, this goes back to the Hunger Games again. So throughout the entire trilogy, Katniss is always talking about how she doesn't want to have children because she doesn't see a future for them. And I always think that's why the Summers family didn't have any children.
I don't know, because I just always got the impression that in this kind of like semi-rural sort of dystopian future, which is quite religious and quite misogynistic, normally that goes hand in hand with people controlling women's reproduction. In other words, I wonder if that would really be a choice that one could make. This doesn't strike me as a world in which people would be able to say, right, you know what, we're not going to have kids now. But I don't know.
In that way, it seems like he's almost an oddity. That
Yeah.
he apparently has no family, and yet he seems to go very much with many of those traditional things you would attribute to that very religious, very rural environment, but no family and no interest in a family.
Is he the Blackfish? Was this guy ever married?
I don't know. That's the question. There's not much.
He does have a scald of a wife.
Yeah,
Oh, does
that's
he?
right.
I was just watching the 2009, and it didn't. The 2009 version of the film, and it didn't seem like he had a family there. But I guess he might have in the.
Or maybe
text.
he was like the Blackfish and held out for a long time, but finally had to succumb to the scald of a wife. But it was too late for them to have kids. She was beyond childbearing age.
I have to write up that theory.
I always think, so you're taking part in the lottery and it's done through slips of paper. So what would happen if someone just walked in one day and they had a blank piece of paper? They could just, do the switch to make sure but then I guess the thing would happen again.
It's weird because a lot of this does seem to go off the honor system. It's not like the Hunger Games where we have everyone being checked to be checked in, and it's all very structured and it's all very controlled. But with this, people can kind of do what they want. As we were saying before, even if they wanted to, they seem to be able to just not do the lottery this year if they didn't want to. So
Yeah,
that's one of the really disturbing things.
Like, I was just thinking, what would stop you just leaving town for a week?
They
It
actually
doesn't appear to
mention
be
that, they bring that up in the 1996 film. So there's a mechanic, he wants to go to a football game. It's on the day of the lottery, but they won't let him leave the town.
Okay, so there is a compulsion. But I think the idea of it being an honor system makes sense if you take it as read that this isn't some kind of federal law. So if they themselves are choosing to do it, then it makes sense it would be an honor system. Because this is nothing to do with, the Hunger Games. This is a major imposition of law and therefore has to be policed. But who's going to police this, other than Mr. Summers? But my God, they do put a lot of faith in him not to have it rigged or anything. But then again, how do you rig a straw poll? I don't know. But do you, Glenn, I think have a theory that it was rigged or someone's rigging
Well, I
it?
was opening up as a suggestion. I mean, would it be possible for him to rig the lottery? Like if
that blew my mind.
Well,
he has control of the black box and the slips of paper. Him and Mr. Graves have control of that each day, and Mr. Graves, I suppose, is like the adjudicator of the lottery. And I guess if he had, do people put their faith in Mr. Summers to conduct the lottery in a fair way?
I guess to discuss the mechanics of how he could rig it, I'm not entirely certain how, with an open drawing, that he could make sure that a certain person got the black spot, unless he was, I don't know, making sure that he had one picked out for somebody.
I mean, I think you can't rig it so that someone you don't like picks the black spot. You could rig it if someone were utterly depressed and done with this and wanted to sort of commit suicide by being stoned, as unlikely as that is. You could have Mr. Summers just fill it all up with white papers, and the person who wants to commit suicide palm a paper with a black dot and just produce that. But, so technically you could do it in reverse, but who on earth would want to do that? It's bonkers.
Even if someone wanted
I'm sure
to,
there are better, methods of suicide.
Yeah. And you'd have to get Mr. Summers to be complicit.
Right. exactly.
And,
I don't think
the whole
he's
kind of
the guy.
Santa Claus / Bill Clinton /
Yeah.
wise smiling town.
You would not go against the rules. That's not the Mr. Summers
Yeah,
way.
he's definitely one of those Jobsworth people who is sticking very closely to what he perceives to be the regulations.
When Tessie arrives to the town, he does say, "I thought we would have to get on without you," and I always thought of that as a ominous, sort of clue to, well, as in a theory of like she was selected prior to the lottery as the person that was going to be stoned to death.
I also got the sense, but as I thought about it, I got the feeling that that was my other dystopian fiction where there are definitely more harsh repercussions for not participating, coloring my perception, making me think that he would go kill her because she didn't show up or something like that.
But surely, if for whatever reason, on some kind of humbug, you didn't show up, I mean, aren't all the other villagers going to have a real go at you for the rest of the year? And can you be picked in absence? So if the Hutchinsons had drawn, so Bill gets the black mark, and the second round goes to the participants in the family. I mean, do they just do, say, 4 slips of paper and they all choose 4, and if the one remaining has the black dot, she still is going to get stoned and they drag her out?
It's possible. I got the sense that they were placing a lot of import on participation and being there in the square at the time, but that could just be, I mean, they want you there, so it's easier and more expedient.
Yeah, but if that's the case, then surely in the days leading up to it, at all town meetings and whatnot, they'll be putting up signs in the village saying, remember, this Saturday is the lottery. So that makes the whole concept of her, oh, whoops, I kind of nearly forgot that it was taking place, even more bizarre. If they're placing that much, emphasis on turning up, they would be telling people to turn up, surely.
And it's such a small town, and they mention it only takes about 2 or 3 hours to complete. Whereas in larger towns, it takes 2 days to complete the lottery, the 26th and the 27th.
Yeah, and don't you find like the weirdest thing in this whole story, the concept that, let's start early in the morning so we can get it done by lunch. Like, we're going to kill someone, then we're all going to sit down for a hearty, cheese ploughman's. Brilliant. I just find that so sinister.
Yeah, to me, the most disturbing elements of this story are how lackadaisically they're handling it in those ways, where they're just willing to move on with their day. It's just another part of the routine, and that whole idea of routine and tradition is really the most sinister part of this.
Exactly. I need to, plow the lower fields. Let's get moving. It's just bizarre.
Yeah.
So the final family that I want to talk about is the Watson family. So I've mentioned my theory before about his father had been stoned 2 years ago, and he was just not of age the previous year. So he would be 16 this year and liable to draw as the head of house. And I just realised I don't have anything else to say about him.
Well, there's not a lot of lines devoted to him in an already short story, right? So
absolutely,
that's fine.
The little exchange there does definitely reinforce that misogynistic tone to the story, where he's saying, where Mr. Summers is saying, "Good fellow lad, glad to see your mother's got a man to do it," which is definitely reinforcing of that feeling.
Yeah, it's slightly annoying.
Okay, we can move on from character and discuss theme, but then we've already done that.
I tell you what, though, I wanted to bring up when I was doing a bit of reading around.
Okay.
There's this one academic article which says that every single name in the story has significance. I'm not sure if you've seen this. And I have some sympathy with it. So the idea that, Delacroix obviously hints to the cross and the religious themes. And Graves, very obvious. Summers, maybe ironic. But this one was like taking it to extremes. So he was saying that, the Martin apparently has some etymological derivation from monkey, and therefore the savagery within us. And it felt to me a little bit like a stretch, but I just wondered if other people gave more credence to that. And also there was a big thing about the Hutchinsons. Apparently there was some very famous American woman called Annie Hutchinson in maybe the 1600s, who was a sort of Protestant dissenter, and I think was in a kind of like Scarlet Letter type situation, sort of like hounded out of or stoned out of a village or something. So apparently you can read into it all these like deeper layers relating to the names. So do we think that's a stretch, or do we think there's something to that?
No, I
think
think
this.
the author did choose, the names with a purpose. The only so I have noticed the obvious ones, Graves and Summers, but also the first person to select is Adams.
Yeah. And there's an Eve as well as a character.
Yeah, I do think there's definitely a case to be made there. I think that would be something this author might be interested in doing. I did definitely pick up on the obvious ones, of course. Actually, one thing I like to think about when I look at this story is what Mr. Graves and Mr. Summer go off and do, since they seem to be buds. like what kind of activities are they up to? And for some reason, their names was a reinforcer that they're doing something weird.
But I have to say the concept that Martin is somehow in some complex way derived from something simian was it was like a leap too far for me.
Yeah, I can see that. Things like the Hutchinson and the relating it back to historical context, I think there's a case to be made for that.
But when you study it, because when kids do it in school in the US, I wonder what the case that's made to them, like what the teachers sort of say.
I didn't really actually study it too deeply in any of my classes, this specific story, but I imagine it's just I imagine that it probably comes up those more obvious names where they're just talking about like the irony of Mr. Summers, and it might go deeper. I don't know. I think it's possible.
One thing I would mention is the black box and how, I mean, Mr. Graves and Mr. Summers, they go through so much effort the night before. They do it. They draw up the paper slips, the 300 paper slips,
to
go into the box, and then they do all these other things. They talk about how they always aim to improve the system to, I think they're talking about the black box, to make another black box, because the one that they have right now is in disrepair.
And yet it has legendary pieces of the original black box in it, so they're reluctant to give it up.
One of the things that I thought about when reading about the black box was obviously the religious connotation to it, and it reminded me of the Weirwoods in A Song of Ice and Fire, and how they were giving this arbitrary meaning to these faces that people carved on these trees, and how that may have had a very sinister beginning, and we get a little bit of hints of that later in, but I don't want to spoil, but I think that was a relationship I saw between that and this box.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have to say this again is just part of my own little crazy world. But what it reminded me of, this is going to sound so stupid, is the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer, so our finance minister, or actually all ministers of state in the UK, back in the day, would have carried home their official government papers in a red box. And to this day, every single minister of state still has a red box, like a big kind of wooden briefcase type thing. And I was listening to this radio program when they said the current Chancellor of the Exchequer kind of got a new red box, but he kind of got one that was aged to make it look like it was old and like had bits of old red boxes in it. So this idea of, these old traditions and rituals and UK Parliament is filled with them, that probably once upon a time had a deep meaning. Now it's just this almost fetishization. I can't even say the word. Like we're making a fetish of it. So, you have to sort of keep the bits of the box. And it just seems so stupid in the story. And then you realize we're doing it in England or in Britain to this very day, in something as serious as how your finance minister carries around his papers. So that lends credibility and plausibility to it, I guess.
And you can say, oh, we're nothing like these characters at all. We would never get like this. You can say that all you want, but when you think about it, many of the things that they do can be related back to a realistic context. And what's interesting to me is that the fact that this was published in 1948, and yet still many of the themes that show up in it are very relatable to today, which shows up a lot in literature, obviously. But I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely an M. Night Shyamalan movie waiting to happen, isn't it?
Oh, man.
Like The Village or something. I'm amazed. I'm amazed someone like him or Tim Burton hasn't tackled it and sort of like expanded it out to make a big movie.
Well, I think that it shows up in a lot of other things like The Hunger Games and other stories like that. I think that
the Wicker Man.
actually... Oh, yeah, definitely, and a lot of other stuff. I think that legitimately adapting this into a feature film would be challenging, to say the least.
But they'd broaden it out, wouldn't they? They'd give backstory and they'd kind of show the ramifications. And you'd have some hero family who were like, oh, this is wrong. We need to try and subvert it and get out and change. And, you could see it happening.
That's exactly what they did.
That's the Hunger Games.
Well, the 1996 movie.
Or is that really what happens?
Yep. So a guy who is what happens is there's a guy, his father dies, and he says, "Oh, before I die, scatter my ashes on your mother's grave." So he has to go back to this town where 20 years before his mother was stoned to death as the winner of the lottery. And it just seems so bizarre to me that he would suggest that his son go back to that town, especially around the time when they're going to do the lottery.
Yeah, talk about throwing your kids under a bus.
But yep, so the setup of that movie is different, so that they make it look like it's just this town that do it, and it's this cult thing that's taking place.
Okay.
And then when he goes to the police and says, "This town, they're crazy. They murdered someone because someone drew a slip of paper from a box." So the police get involved, and they're trying to find out what's happening, and the whole town is this operates a cover-up story. So,
you see, that to me sounds exactly like the Wicker Man, so the Edward Woodward cult horror movie, where Edward Woodward is this kind of repressed policeman who goes to investigate a similar kind of story and ends up on this like remote Scottish island populated by ludicrously fit women, but then ends up getting, oh, I shouldn't spoil it actually, because people out there might not have read The Wicker Man, but or watched The Wicker Man. But yeah, if you want to see what happens when the police go to investigate, you should watch that movie. You also get to see Britt Eklund dubbed with a very heavy Scottish accent, which is like one of the most bizarre things to watch.
I do like to imagine, though, that this was a widespread thing that was affecting a lot of people, not just this one town. Well, obviously, that we know that in the story, but I like that idea because I feel like you can relate it back to a lot of other dystopian fantasy where some kind of Big Brother collapse, apocalypse sort of situation happened, and it got to be this way. And what I like about that is that you can very clearly see how far people can fall when they're just left to their own devices without any kind of oversight.
Absolutely. I think that's what makes it powerful, that there isn't a big brother in this case. And, at some point in the future of the story, there's going to be a really interesting point where, 98% of villagers have given it up and there's a few holdouts. And whether the people who've given it up because they've decided, they thought better of it, decide if they want to try and impose that new value set on these remaining 2% holdouts in a kind of Danny freeing the slaves kind of a way.
And one thing you have to wonder is if they're getting rid of it, does that necessarily mean that it's going to lead to something better? Maybe they just are tired of these old rules. They want to do something even worse, maybe. It's something I think about.
Oh, that's true, actually. I just assume that you get rid of it and you get something more enlightenment. But you're right. It could be like a long slide towards savagery.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we've covered everything so far. Do you want to just do the marry one night or win the lottery game?
I'm not sure exactly how one does that with this set of characters, but we can have a go. I'm also amazed we've managed to talk for an hour about a story that you can literally read in 20 minutes.
For this game, so it's just Tessie Hutchison, Old Man Warner, and Mr. Summers. So starting off with Tessie Hutchison, let's see, I would win the lottery rather than marry or one night with her.
Yeah, I think so too. She's a lot of not too attractive traits about her.
Yeah, the sketchiness of not showing up and then the throwing her daughter under a bus, definitely scorpions.
And Old Man Warner. So in that case, if it's Young Man Warner, then I would definitely marry him because I would never be selected for the lottery. So it's just the definition of not winning the lottery is to marry Old Man Warner.
So Old Man Warner is like in the Origins version where he's young and fit.
Absolutely, yep.
No, I would marry him because I think that might soften him up a bit. I think that he might be less jaded than he is now if he has some kind of companionship. But maybe I'm reading that wrong because obviously now he's jaded. Maybe I'm the person who gets killed and that's why he's like this. That's how it played out.
See, I'm going to marry him and assume that he has a lower probability of picking the black dot paper.
He's just safe.
Yeah, exactly. I'm gonna ride his luck.
Finally, Mr. Summers. So Mr. Summers, just because I still think that he has some power in the lottery and is unlikely to win, I would marry him.
So you're making a career marriage, Glenn.
That's right.
I'll go with one night because I want to see what he gets off to with Mr. Graves because I'm very curious about their relationship. I'm not sure why, but I'm curious.
Okay, so I totally agree. So I think one night just to enable us to plant some like listening devices and whatnot in his house.
Yes.
And also if he's played by like a young Bill Clinton, that would just be hilarious.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the show over. Thanks for joining me today.
No problem. It was a great idea. And I wonder if anyone in Vassals of Kingsgrave is going to do a Hunger Games podcast, actually.
Yeah,
well, we talked about it a bunch.
It's not listed in the topics so far, the topic list, but I have made one for the Catching Fire movie.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I would be up for that. I think it's I don't think it's as well written as some of the other fantasy novels, but I think it's definitely interesting. So
agreed.
Cool. Okay, well, have a great weekend, everyone. Thanks for organising, Glenn.
You too.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.